Good morning, everyone. It's a big pleasure to welcome you all to the final conference of the Reform Project, the instrumentation and enactment of public education reform. These welcome words are in the name of the amazing team that has organized together with me this conference and the whole project. You will distinguish them because they wear the blue badge, and there are too many of them here to name all. Before I introduce and give the floor to our guest in this inaugural session, I would like to tell you about the objectives and the rationale of this event. The main goal of the conference is to exchange about recent trends and dynamics in educational reform, and also about the changing nature of educational policy change. Making sense of the nature and dynamics of educational reform is challenging because it means aiming to capture a constantly changing object, trying to make sense of a very evolving research object. Indeed, long periods of policy stability are rare in the educational sector. Educational systems, and with them, schools and teachers, are expected to constantly adapt to economic, societal, and technological pressures and innovations. Globalization has only exacerbated this trend by intensifying and speeding up the movement of policy ideas, but also by generating additional pressures on nations for educational improvement. Constant reform continually disrupts schools and teachers and often faces them with contradictory expectations and mandates. Indeed, contemporary educational reforms try to achieve objectives that are not always easy to combine. To start with, at the same time that we witness an increasing reform emphasis on schools' effectiveness and learning outcomes-based management, schools are also expected to be inclusive institutions, promote students' well-being, and serve their emotional needs. Other tensions that are inherent to current reform debates can be found in the standardization versus innovation movements, a push for teaching to the attachment versus student-centered pedagogies, and the promotion of teachers' professional autonomy at the same time that new and more sophisticated forms of governance at a distance are being enacted. In this conference, we will try to make sense of these and other tensions, how they configure different reform trajectories, and what do they do in terms of the structuration of education systems and the teaching profession. Capturing this complexity is an enterprise that requires from an interdisciplinary effort. Thus, by design, in the conference, we have aimed to put into dialogue education policy studies with public policy and policy sociology studies, at the same time that we also aim to promote cross-fertilization between comparative education and broader global policy and political economy studies. Analytically, the sequence of educational reform is also unpredictable and does not follow a pre-established pattern. So, for instance, in most cases, does not follow the conventional goals definition followed by instruments adoption sequence. Our empirical observations, in fact, show that more often than not, policy instruments are adopted independently of the problems they are expected to address or the goals they are supposed to serve. So despite often portrayed as second-order changes, the adoption of new instruments can trigger broad institutional transformations or third-order change, to use Peter Hall's famous terminology. The keynote speakers have been carefully selected to address some of these puzzles. They will provide us with theoretical input on the constitutive power of policy instruments, the political economy of educational reforms, and on how do new governance instruments affect practice and school and social relations in education. Beyond the keynotes, we will also have a roundtable where we will discuss about the complex interaction between teachers' autonomy and accountability. And in the networks, we will have a lot of quality time to discuss about our work on these matters. We will be discussing about all these topics outside of the usual academic environment. We chose the Orlandi house for practical reasons, but also for symbolic reasons. Between 1956 and 1974, this is in the last 20 years of the long dictatorship of General Franco, this building allocated a school that aimed to vindicate and recuperate the pedagogical renewal movement of the Second Spanish Republic. The school promoted values such as equality, diversity, sociability, and the defense of the Catalan language in an era in which our language was openly prohibited as means of instruction. With the transition to democracy, the school moved to a new public equipment and now is a community center, as you can see. Say this, I would like to give the floor to our two guests in this welcome ceremony. Gita Steiner-Khamsi is a professor of comparative and international education at Teachers College, Columbia University in New York. Actually, in the last 5 years, she had a second part-time faculty position at the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies in Geneva to build comparative and international policy studies in education and to act as the academic director of NORAC. Actually, you finished this position 5 years ago. She is really well known for her work in the field of comparative and international education, policy transfer, and globalization. But she's here today for these reasons, but also because she represents the numerous senior scholars that have supported our research with scientific advice and generous mentorship. Xavier Bonal will follow as the director of the JEPS Center, where our project has been executed. He and all the JEPS members have been extremely supportive and generated a very stimulating environment, academically speaking, for conducting research. He is a professor of sociology at UAB. His work focuses on the areas of education policy, educational inequalities, globalization, and the right to education. And his recent work on school segregation is not only having an important impact in academia, but also in the field of policy and practice. So, Gita, the floor is yours.
Can you hear me? Yes. Thank you very much for this generous invitation. Yes, much better. Thank you. I would like to say a few words on why, for me, Reform Ed is comparative policy studies par excellence. It's genuine comparative policy studies, and it combines two fields: the theory and the study of the policy process, and comparative education. And let me tell you why. And by doing so, it actually exceeds both fields and contributes to both fields. It is, as Tony also mentioned, really draws from public policy studies in a good sense. It takes theories on the policy process and debates that are taking place in public policy in the domain of education, but not necessarily only in the domain of education. And an example is to say that the group, you could look at SAVA, school autonomy with accountability policies, as many did before, as just a decentralization policy. It's a governance reform. But unless you have a public policy or a policy understanding, you don't see the bigger picture, that it's about the instruments of policy. It's about the policy process. It's not just about the opponents and proponents and about the topic of a reform, but how it melds together, how it's all connected. The one figure that Tony Verger developed together with Susan Robertson and published in 2012 in the Public-Private Partnership book, I think it overtook, thank God, The Cube by Murray Thomas and Mark Bray. It is one of the most cited figures, and maybe just to remind you which one it is, it's the one that shows the shift towards outcomes-based regulation as a result, as part of the market model in education or new public management, as a result of which there are incentives for the private sector to come in. There is parental choice funding is student-based rather than incremental. There is a test regime, what you then later on call an accountability regime, and together with that test regime, there is a whole apparatus to communicate the test results. Together with parental choice, the idea of this instrument, it's an instrument, but it's a whole logic. It's the whole neoliberal logic. As part of this instrument, it is a perpetuating machinery that keeps going. And the idea is once you have parental choice, then the good schools will do better, and the poorly performing choice will basically be phased out. We know it's not true. It does not happen. It creates inequalities. It exacerbates inequalities. But it is a model, and just the way to think about outcomes-based regulation and to think about reforms not just as a topic, decentralization, competency-based curriculum reform, and other global education policies, but as instruments is genuine policy. It's a policy way of looking at developments. So this is one example, and in fact, the topic of the conference, the instrumentation and enactment of public education reform, is exactly in this line of argument. And one of the interesting papers I read of the paper, Sorensen's paper, looks into the detail on policy instruments, and it mentions Capano and Howlett, who are like textbook authors in public policy studies, how in policy studies we have for too long looked at input and actors and not so much on policy instruments and the impact of policy instruments on actual reform. So the Reform Ed really contributes to this body of research in public policy, but it exceeds it, because public policy is a little bit parochial, it's very domestic, it does not have this transnational view. And this is the second aspect, which makes Reform Ed genuine comparative policy studies. It's comparative. Xavier, as Jeps would say, it's global, it's a global education policy. And any global education, any study of the global education policy starts with a lazy S-curve. And I saw the lazy S-curve on your Reform Ed also. All it takes is two-dimensional plot. You have on the x-axis year from, in your case, 1995 to 2014. And then you show the number of education systems that adopt a policy. In this case, the SAVA policy. But we had other studies. They looked at accountability in higher education or per student financing, all a zillion other global education policy. Usually it's a lazy S-curve because it starts with a few countries that adopt the policy, and then there's exponential growth, and then it phases out because most countries adopted it. Tony's curve is not yet a lazy S-curve because it's not saturated yet. There are more and more countries coming in. But it shows beautifully, the SAVA curve shows how more and more OECD countries adopted test-based accountability measures. And not only they adopted the measures, but they increased the number of tests used for those measures. So this in itself is a brilliant finding and very much down the line of global education policy studies and comparative policy studies, because you do need a transnational view to even get to this point, to show these trends, right? In our field that work in global education policy or comparative policy studies, we have two camps, and they complement each other. We have the camp with the Stanford with the SUSE group, Stanford University School of Education, with brilliant minds such as Patricia Bromley, most recently, who they look at big trends, 50 years, 100 years, 150 years, and they show interesting patterns. So one of the very interesting papers that Jane, Tony, and I and others were able to listen from this group is how they looked at reform occurrence over time. And they showed that between 1991 and 2008, that was the busiest time it was buzzing with reforms. countries were buzzing and adopting. Now, and this is the time of neoliberal reform. After 2008, there was like a abrupt change. There was like a reform fatigue. And I would say COVID probably exacerbated that reform fatigue even more. But there is a lot to be said about looking at trends and describing them exactly and empirically. And this is the strength, I would say, of the Stanford group. Then there's this other group, and I would say Tony's group and the Reform Ed group is in the other group. We use the same plot, the same lazy S-curve that also the Stanford group has. We use the same in the Reform group. I use it with my group of people. But we look at the dots. The dots are not just gray dots or points put in a curve. We look at individual cases. So it's not a coincidence that the Reform Ed project also produced case studies, trying to understand context. And this is very much in line with Tony Verger's other work on pathways, trying to understand why does something resonate at a particular time? How does that fit a past history, a historical trajectory? And then how is it translated? What does test-based accountability mean in different contexts and in different countries? So usually these countries that look at the dots as cases rather than just dots in a curve to show global trends, they look at reception and translation processes. At what moment is a global education policy adopted? Why? Who loses, who wins as a result of this adoption, and what does it mean, or how is it translated or implemented? And when I say, just to finish my introduction, that is too long already, but let me just finish to say that this is really the strength of the Reform Ed project, that it looks using a political economy lens, sometimes a historical institutionalism lens, to really look at those individual cases and the local dynamics that it generates. It's a result of, but it also generates and reproduces. As I said, it is more than the sum of comparative ed and policy studies. The Reform Ed project and comparative policy studies does more than just combining two fields. It breaks the parochiality, if this is the right word, or the domestic thinking, the narrow thinking of public policy studies that is very national in its orientation, but it also fills the black hole that we have in comparative ed sometimes. Comparative education can be very atheoretical, especially the US version of comparative education. So by drawing from sociology and political science and theories on the policy process, it brings theory in the comparative ed discussion. It has been a great pleasure to observe as an outsider the Reform Ed project, and I've been very inspired always to read all your publications that you have developed in this project. So even though this is the final project, I'm sure there will be more to come and more to read, and I look forward to it. Good luck with the conference.
I'll be brief. Okay, it's really a pleasure as director of the GEPS, of the Globalization, Education and Social Policy Research Group, to welcome you all here and to share this nice table with Tony and Gita. I think after 5 or 6 years already, Tony, about the Reform Ed project, as a research group, we are extremely proud of the project. We are extremely proud of the outcomes. But we are still more proud about the process of how this research has been carried out, and I will refer to a few things that I think justify this way of thinking. I think Reform Ed is, at least there's two main things that I think I want to highlight about the project. The first one has to do with the epistemological and methodological approach of the project. I think in the field, as Gita was mentioning, in the field of education policy studies, international comparative education, the type of policy instruments, the type of methodological tools that mainstream approaches are used to use are limited if we want to critically explain some of the trajectories and some of the effects of these policies. And I think reform has made an amazing work, both in terms of the theoretical foundations that informs many of the topics that have been within the topic of SAWA policies, and also the capacity of using the methodological creativity to respond with different tools to some of the main difficult research questions. And I think this is the only way by which we can explore unpredicted or unexpected effects of some policies. And I think reform has done this brilliantly. The second thing I want to highlight is that it has become a platform for early research trainers. Most of them are here in the second row. But it's been amazing to observe and to collaborate in this trip of training of so many people. And the type of research products and the type of thesis and the publications that have come up from the project are really amazing. So I think this is a high value of the Reformer project that has built a great human capital in terms of international and education policy studies in our research center. In terms of content, I think there's just one thing I want to highlight especially. I think the project, as you know, and all of those that have followed more or less the type of products that they have done, they have observed interesting policy trajectories and the enactment of these policy trajectories in accountability policies and school autonomy policies. I think they have brought interesting views and alternative views of understanding how performance-based accountability has effects on teachers' work, which is a very interesting way of looking at it. Multiple ways of understanding a school autonomy and the school's logics of action, how they respond to this context of competition and in the marketplace. I think what is common probably of all these objects and other objects of studies that have been linked to the reform project is that with this approach, they are able to not take for granted the expected effects of the theory of change. And this is almost an obsession of JEPs, I would say, not only of reform. We work with this view of saying, do not take policies as taken for granted, just observe them as hypotheses and try to explore what works for whom and under which circumstances from this critical realist perspective. I think this type of research is today more important and more interesting than ever because we are witnessing levels of increasing inequalities in the urban space, in the educational space, and having these critical approaches that really can uncover and can unpack the black box of some of the policies are more important than ever. So welcome to the Reform Conference. I am sure we'll have a great opportunity to know more about the Reform project during these 3 days, and of course to exchange with all this amazing group of scholars here. Thank you so much.